My name is Major Beatrix Harrington, 38 years old, a major in the British Army, 19 years in uniform, staring down gun barrels in the worst places on earth. And I never thought the place that would take me down would be my own family's dining room on a Christmas evening. The metallic taste of blood pooled in my mouth. My younger sister Sophie's slap landed so hard, the fork in my hand clattered across the tile floor. I sat there, muscles coiled on pure survival instinct, but I held it back. I looked at my father, waiting for a man to step up and restore order. Instead, he shoved his chair back, pointing a finger straight at the front door, his face flushed crimson, his voice a nasty hiss. "Get out of my house. You always bring that military attitude in here and pollute the air." My mother kept her head down, staring a hole into her Brussels sprouts. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the blinding white, snowy London night. But as the door slammed shut behind me, they had no idea about one brutal truth. The person they just kicked out onto the street like a stray dog was the sole legal owner of that entire property. Real quick before the story begins, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Pause for a second and let me know in the comments. Now, let's get into it. The heavy oak door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked into place, a sharp metallic sound cutting through the freezing air. I stood on the snow-covered concrete porch, the tread of my combat boots biting into black ice. The wind blowing off the Thames was brutal, easily 10 below zero, but it didn't make me shiver. I ran my tongue over the split in my lower lip. The blood was already freezing into a hard copper-tasting crust. I didn't wipe it away. I turned on my heel and walked toward the curb, where my Range Rover sat parked in the snow. I kept my spine completely straight. No screaming. No pounding my fists against the wood. The people inside that house did not deserve a single tear from an army officer. I pulled the heavy driver's side door open, threw myself onto the freezing leather seat, and cranked the ignition. The engine growled to life. The heater blasted nothing but icy air against my face. Through the windshield, already gathering a fresh layer of snowflakes, I stared straight into the living room window. Warm yellow light spilled out onto the snowbank. I watched the shadows move behind the glass. My father paced across the room, a crystal glass of expensive brandy gripped in his hand. Sophie was leaning against the dining table, laughing at something he said. They were celebrating. They had just executed the troublemaker. They had just protected their delusional family bubble from the one person who actually held it together. My stomach tightened. It wasn't physical pain. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. On a combat deployment, my squadmates would throw their own bodies over a blast to shield me from flying shrapnel. We bled for each other in the dirt. Tonight, my own blood relative used words like artillery shells to blow a hole right through my chest. 19 years. 19 years of playing the shield, the bank, the silent fixer for their endless messes. And my reward was an eviction notice delivered over a plate of Christmas turkey. Slowly, my heart rate began to drop. The massive adrenaline spike flattened out, returning to a steady, familiar baseline. It was the exact same physiological shift I experienced during night ambushes outside Kandahar. When the enemy has you in their sights, you don't stand there and cry. You lock down your emotions. You find your weapon. I reached over the center console, stretching into the back seat. My fingers found the rough texture of my battered leather briefcase. I hauled it over the console and dropped it onto my lap. The thick brass zipper let out a harsh, rasping sound in the quiet cab. I pulled out my laptop and flipped open the lid. The screen flared to life. The cold blue glow illuminated the dark interior of the truck, casting harsh shadows across the jagged scar under my jawline, a permanent souvenir from an improvised explosive device. I typed in my passcode. My knuckles were white, my fingers stiff from the freezing temperature, but the keystrokes were precise and deliberate. There were no smiling family vacation photos set as my wallpaper. There were only neat numbered folders lined up like soldiers. Information. I dragged the cursor across the trackpad and double-clicked the folder labeled Property Assets. Dozens of legal documents populated the screen. Property tax receipts, insurance declarations, bank routing numbers. My eyes scanned the dense grid of files until they locked onto one specific document. The name of the PDF file was simple, deed.house.df. My index finger hovered over the trackpad. I held it there for exactly 1 second. I looked back up at the living room window. My father was taking another smug sip of his brandy, completely oblivious. He had just kicked me off this property. He had pointed his finger and told me I was polluting his air. A smile pulled at the corner of my split lip. It was a cold, empty expression that never reached my eyes. They wanted a war. They just handed the general the launch codes. Game over. I double-clicked the file. The document loaded, filling the freezing cab of my truck with a harsh, blinding white glare. Right there at the top of the page, the official red seal of the United Kingdom stared back at me. 16 years ago, my father listened to some smooth-talking broker at his golf club and dumped his entire life savings into a garbage mutual fund. 3 months later, a bright neon foreclosure notice ended up taped to that heavy oak front door. Who stepped up and ripped that notice down? I did. My parents didn't call me a hero. They called it the natural duty of a child. I bought that exact house out from under the bank. I cleared the suffocating mortgage using my entire army enlistment bonus and years of my officer's salary. The deed listed one name and one name only: Beatrix Harrington. They lived comfortably inside those insulated walls for over a decade. They never paid a single dime in rent. They never even said thank you. My stiff, freezing finger dragged across the trackpad. I backed out and opened the folder marked living expenses. Row after row of highlighted bank statements populated the screen. £17,500 for a new roof. £7,200 to replace a broken furnace. I remembered authorizing that wire transfer. It was the winter of 2013. I was sitting in a sandbagged forward operating base in Kandahar, chewing on a dry, tasteless meal packet. The air in the bunker tasted like diesel exhaust and fine desert dust. Outside, air raid sirens were screaming over the compound as incoming fire hit the perimeter. I used my hazard pay, literal blood money given to me for dodging mortars in a war zone, so my parents wouldn't freeze to death in the middle of a London winter. Yet tonight, that same man stood in the living room I bought, waving his expensive liquor glass, and screamed that I polluted his air. I scrolled down to the next folder. It was simply labeled Sophie. I opened it. College tuition receipts. First and last month apartment deposits, a massive stack of past due credit card bills. She had the luxury of quitting jobs whenever her boss looked at her wrong. She took vacations to Ibiza. She paraded around acting like a highly successful independent woman because she always had an invisible janitor sweeping up her financial trash. When my mother called me overseas, the satellite connection crackling with static, she never once asked if I was safe. Her voice would just drop into that pathetic, pleading tone. Sophie is short on cash this month. She needs her sister. Just help her out this time, Beatrix. I carried the literal lives of infantrymen on my shoulders in a combat zone. Then I came home and carried a 34-year-old parasite. I grabbed the top of the laptop screen and slammed it shut. The sharp, violent crack of plastic and metal colliding echoed like a gunshot in the tight, cold space of the truck cabin. The delusion of blood loyalty died the exact moment Sophie struck my face, and my father banished me into the snow. I reached up and pulled the sun visor down, flipping open the cover. I stared at my reflection in the small rectangular mirror. The jagged blast scar under my jaw was pale white against the cold. My eyes were entirely dry. There was no grief left in my system, only a cold, calculating anger. The family unit had completely fractured. The rear guard had officially become the front line. I reached across the dark dashboard and grabbed my cell phone. The digital clock on the lock screen glowed brightly in the dark. 23:15, 11:15 at night. I unlocked the screen and scrolled through my contacts until I found the specific name I needed. Sebastian, legal. I pressed the green call button and lifted the cold device to my ear. The phone rang 3 times. A sharp, clear click cut through the line, followed by a calm, deep voice. Sebastian speaking. He was my real estate attorney, the man who had managed every piece of my legal paperwork for the last 12 years while I was deployed overseas. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and he knew my financial architecture better than I did. "It's Beatrix," I said. My eyes were fixed on the house across the street. The warm lights in the living room were finally winking out one by one. They were going to bed satisfied with their little execution. Trigger the asset recovery protocol. The whole thing. Silence hung on the line. It wasn't hesitation. It was the heavy silence of a man mentally opening a very dangerous file. Sebastian knew exactly what that protocol meant. We had drafted it years ago as a worst-case contingency. It meant seizing back the primary residence. It meant pulling the registration on the 2 vehicles listed under my name. It meant a total catastrophic freeze on the emergency trust account. What happened? He asked, his voice not changing pitch. They just threw me out into the snow, I replied, my tone dead flat. My mistake. I gave them the delusion that they were the ones calling the shots. I heard the rough scrape of thick paper shuffling in the background. Sebastian was a professional. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't offer useless sympathy. The Range Rover driven by Colonel Harrington. The Mercedes sedan driven by Margaret Harrington. Sebastian listed them off like targets on a firing range. Auto insurance policies cancelled. 30-day eviction notice drafted and filed for the main property. Are you absolutely certain about this, Beatrix? I reached up with a stiff finger and traced the frozen ridge of dried blood on my lower lip. The sting grounded me. Execute the order. No exceptions. No warnings. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. 2 blocks down the road, the harsh neon lights of a 24-hour petrol station cut through the falling snow. I pulled the truck into the empty lot. The bell above the glass door chimed as I walked in. The air smelled strongly of cheap floor wax and stale hot dogs rotating on metal rollers. I bought a large black coffee. No sugar, no cream. The bitter, scalding liquid burned down my throat, shocking my nerve endings awake. I walked back out to the truck and locked the doors. I sat in the driver's seat for the rest of the night. The engine idled quietly, fighting off the sub-zero chill. I picked up my phone and opened my banking app. I pulled up the master list for autopay accounts. British Electric for the power. The Thames Water Authority for utilities. The massive premium cable and internet package my father insisted on having. The monthly mobile phone bill for Sophie. I hovered my thumb over the screen. One by one, I hit unlink card. Tap, tap. Every single touch of the glass screen was an invisible chain snapping. The safety net was gone. The gravy train had derailed. I drained the last drop of the bitter coffee, crushing the paper cup in my grip. 600 hours. The pitch-black London sky was slowly turning the colour of wet concrete. The defroster had finally melted the thick crust of ice off the windshield, leaving heavy drops of water running down the glass like sweat. I shifted the truck into drive. The heavy tyres crunched over the packed snow as the Range Rover rolled out of the parking lot, leaving the quiet suburban neighbourhood behind. At that exact second, I knew Sebastian's automated server was firing off the legal artillery. A 30-day notice to vacate the premises was landing in my father's inbox. A demand for the immediate surrender of the vehicle keys. A total freeze on their credit history. Today, the Harrington family was going to wake up not to the smell of bacon frying in the kitchen. They were going to wake up to the smell of total collapse, 800 hours on a freezing Friday morning. I was sitting in my cramped tactical office at Aldershot, cross-checking a long inventory list of heavy equipment. The air in the room was thick with the harsh smell of industrial gun oil and cold steel. Suddenly, my personal mobile phone buzzed against the metal desk. The cheap plastic casing rattled violently against the steel surface. The caller ID flashed a single word. Father. 15 minutes ago, Sebastian's automated server had confirmed the delivery of the legal notices. The artillery had officially landed. I didn't pick up right away. I let the phone vibrate through its entire first ring cycle. I picked up a plastic water bottle, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down. When the second ring cut through the quiet hum of the office, I tapped the answer icon and put it on speaker. I didn't say hello. I didn't make a sound. Instantly, a furious, animalistic roar blasted out of the tiny speaker. What the hell is this? What is this goddamn notice about the house? His voice cracked. It was completely stripped of the arrogant patriarchal authority he threw around so easily just last night. The king had lost his crown. I picked up a metal pen. I rolled it slowly between my thumb and index finger. That is a formal termination of your property usage rights, I replied. My voice was low, steady, dead cold. You don't have the right. You cannot do this to me. This is my house, he screamed. I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing slapping against the microphone. Panic was setting in. I raised an eyebrow at the metal wall across from me. Incorrect. That is my house. You have exactly 30 days to find a new place to live. Total silence over the line. 1, 2, 3 seconds. His brain completely stalled out, unable to process the absolute suffocating weight of the truth. Then the narcissistic survival instinct kicked in. He couldn't win on facts, so he instantly shifted his tactics to the only thing he knew. Guilt. You are overreacting, he stammered, trying to lower his voice to sound reasonable. Last night was just a minor argument. Are you seriously going to destroy this entire family over one little slap? The absolute sheer nerve of the man forced a bitter, dry laugh out of my throat. When I suffered 2 fractured ribs during an insurgent ambush in Iraq, my phone never rang, he never called. When he threw me out into the freezing London snow, he called it teaching me respect. But now that his free ride was getting towed away, he called it an overreaction. I leaned forward. My mouth was inches from the speaker. It wasn't one slap. It was 19 years of treating me like an emotionless ATM. You owe this family, he hissed through his teeth. There it was. The ugly, toxic core of the Harrington family dynamic laid bare in 5 words. He honestly believed that simply because he contributed half my DNA, he owned my life, my paycheck, and my dignity. I stopped rolling the pen. I brought the heavy metal tip down hard against the steel desk. Crack! The sharp noise cut his rant off instantly. What exactly do I owe you? I asked. The air in my office felt dangerously still. The mortgage money? The car payments? Or maybe the college tuition for your golden child? No, I owe you nothing. This is done. I reached over and stabbed the red button on the screen. The call ended. The screen went pitch black, plunging the room back into the quiet hum of the military base. 3 days later, 1400 hours. I was sitting in my truck eating a cold sandwich when Sebastian's name popped up on the screen. Status report. His deep voice came through the speaker. The recovery team is on site. A few seconds later, a short video file dropped into our secure chat. It was dashboard camera footage from the flatbed tow truck. The amber strobe lights flashed off the snowbanks. There, parked in the driveway, was the late model Range Rover, the exact same vehicle my father used to parade around his buddies at the local golf club, acting like he was a self-made titan of industry. The heavy steel chains clanked loudly as the repo driver hooked them under the front axle. Suddenly, the front door of the house flew open. My father bolted out onto the freezing concrete. He wasn't wearing a coat. He stood there shivering in a thin dress shirt, waving his arms and pointing a finger directly in the repo driver's face. The driver didn't even flinch. He just kept working the winch controls. Across the street, I could see 2 neighbors peering over their wooden privacy fences, watching the whole thing unfold. The illusion of the highly successful upper-middle-class Harrington family was completely shattered, dragged away on a flatbed truck for the whole neighborhood to see. I checked my phone's call log. 14 missed calls. 7 from my father. 5 from my Aunt Constance, who always stuck her nose where it didn't belong. 2 from my mother. She had left a single voicemail. I hit play. Beatrix. Her voice trembled. Your father says you are taking the car back. Why did you not warn us? How are we supposed to get to church on Sunday? I deleted the message before she even finished speaking. She could sit there and eat her vegetables while her own flesh and blood got assaulted in her dining room. But a repossessed Range Rover? That was the tragedy that finally made her cry. The real fallout arrived the very next afternoon. I had just pulled into the parking lot of my rented flat near the base. The heavy metal door had not even clicked shut behind me when the screech of hard braking echoed across the black top. I turned around. An Uber pulled up aggressively to the curb. Sophie threw the back door open and stumbled out. She looked like a total wreck. Her expensive makeup was smeared under her eyes. Her hair was a tangled mess. The arrogant, smug girl who slapped me on Christmas was entirely gone. She stomped up the concrete stairs, the heels of her boots hitting the steps with a heavy, frantic rhythm. She reached the top landing and immediately started pounding her fists against my steel security door. "Open the door, Beatrix. Open the damn door right now." Her voice was shrill. It grated on my nerves like fingernails scraping down a chalkboard. I reached out, unlatched the deadbolt, and pulled the heavy door open. The cold iron door frame acted like a physical border crossing between 2 entirely different worlds. Sophie lunged forward, stopping just inches from my face. She pointed a finger wrapped in chipped gel polish right at my chest. "Are you insane? The emergency trust account is locked. My credit cards are declining at the supermarket. You are ruining my life." I crossed my arms over my chest. I planted my boots firmly on the threshold, refusing to give up a single inch of ground. "That account is under my name," I said, keeping my voice dead flat. "Those credit cards are under my name. But my rent is due next week." "You are stealing my money," she screamed, spit flying from her mouth. I tilted my head, looking down at her. My eyes were as sharp as a scalpel. "Your money? Then use your money to pay for it. Get off my porch." Sophie physically recoiled. Her eyes went wide, pretending to look terrified. She reached for the one weapon she had always used to manipulate this family: tears. Thick drops welled up, cutting wet tracks through her smeared mascara. "Are you really this cruel?" she whimpered, her voice trembling on purpose. "Over one stupid argument? It was just a slap. So what? I'm your sister. So what?" The air on the concrete landing seemed to freeze solid. If an enemy combatant pointed a weapon at me in a war zone, I put them in the dirt. But here, standing on a cheap apartment balcony, a blood relative struck me in the face and demanded I continue paying her rent. I stepped forward. My heavy boots hit the concrete with a dull thud. I backed her up, forcing her to retreat until her spine hit the iron railing of the walkway. She smelled like stale alcohol, cheap cigarette smoke and desperation. "One slap and 19 years of playing the maid," I said. My voice was low and cold. "When I was lying on a cot in a field hospital in Kandahar, bleeding through my bandages, you called to demand cash for a designer handbag. When I ran 3 consecutive days on zero sleep on patrol, you drained the emergency fund to go on a beach vacation." Sophie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The fake tears stopped. "You never looked at me as a sister," I continued, locking my eyes onto hers. "You looked at me like a cash machine." Her wall of excuses completely shattered. Her knees buckled. She slumped down against the iron railing, the cold metal pressing into her back. All the arrogant entitlement was gone. She was just a 34-year-old parasite staring at a host that just cut off the blood supply. "What am I supposed to do now?" she gasped. Her chest heaved in pure, unadulterated panic. I looked down at her. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity. No guilt. Giving her an inch of leniency had created this monster. Being ruthless was the exact cure she needed. I spoke 3 slow, deliberate words. "Get a job." I turned my back, stepped inside my flat, and slammed the heavy steel door shut. I threw the deadbolt. The loud metallic clack echoed like a gunshot, sealing the border between us. Her shrill sobbing seeped through the metal frame, ringing down the empty concrete hallway. I ignored it. My phone lit up on the kitchen counter, buzzing angrily against the wood. The screen cast a pale glow in the dim room. A new text message. It was from my mother. "We cannot live like this. Please, Beatrix, meet your father and me at the Richmond Tea House tomorrow at noon. We need to talk." I stared at the glowing letters. They were completely out of ammunition. The bank accounts were frozen. The cars were gone. The eviction notice was real. They wanted to negotiate. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the glass screen. I typed a single word and hit send. Okay. Tomorrow I was bringing the old leather briefcase. I was bringing the property tax records. I was bringing the bank statements. The court of truth was officially in session. 11:50. I pushed through the glass door of the Richmond Tea House. The air inside smelled like burnt roast coffee and cheap frying oil. Instead of my usual civilian clothes, I wore my full combat uniform. The heavy fabric, the crisp lines, the polished brass insignia on my collar. I wanted them to remember exactly who they were dealing with. I walked past the crowded counter and picked a round table in the far back corner. I sat with my spine perfectly straight, my back pressed flat against the wall, a standard tactical position. It gave me a clear line of sight over the entire room. 12:05. The chime above the door rang. The 3 of them walked in. There was no swagger left. My father led the way. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle twitched. My mother trailed closely behind him, keeping her eyes glued to the scuffed linoleum floor. Sophie dragged her feet in the back, looking completely hollowed out. They slid into the chairs across from me. Nobody flagged down a waitress. Nobody ordered coffee. My father cleared his throat. He puffed out his chest, trying to scrape together whatever authority he thought he still had. "You deceived us. You and that lawyer of yours hid everything." I didn't waste a single breath arguing with the stupid accusation. I reached down and popped the brass latches on my old leather briefcase. I pulled out a solid 3-inch thick stack of paperwork and dropped it onto the wooden table. Thud. The heavy sound hit them like a brick. I peeled the first sheet of paper off the top and slid it across the sticky table directly toward my father. The official property deed, stamped and dated 2024. Sole owner, Beatrix Harrington. His eyes locked onto the black ink. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down, but he kept his mouth shut. I kept dealing the papers like a blackjack dealer. "Property tax records for the last 16 years, I said, my voice dead flat. A £12,800 invoice for repairing the house foundation. Auto insurance premiums. I pushed the pile forward. backing them into a corner made entirely of facts. My mother reached out with a trembling, wrinkled hand. She picked up one of the bank statements. Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. All of this is yours." I leaned forward over the table, locking my eyes onto hers. Do you know what the worst part is? Every single one of these documents was mailed directly to the house, but you never opened a single envelope, because you weren't the ones paying the bills. I grabbed the final stack of receipts and shoved it towards Sophie. College tuition, security deposits, overdue credit card warnings. Do you have any idea how many birthdays I spent sitting in a war zone? I asked. The words hit the table like lead weights. Do you know how many times I had to sign over my combat hazard pay just to save this family from declaring bankruptcy? The air around the table grew thick and heavy. The ambient noise of the cafe seemed to completely fade away. Sophie buried her face in her hands. The loud, wet sound of her crying broke the silence. My mother slumped forward, dropping her head over her arms. Her shoulders shook violently. I didn't know. She sobbed into her sleeves. I really didn't know. She wasn't lying. She didn't know because she actively chose to keep her eyes shut. It was easier to play dumb than to acknowledge the blood I was bleeding to keep them afloat. But the blindfold was off now. The delusion was stripped bare, laid out in black and white ink. The weeping continued. I sat back and waited. 3 women sat at the table, but the trial wasn't over. Slowly, all eyes shifted away from the papers, turning to look directly at my father. My father sat completely motionless. A heavy bead of sweat broke out on his forehead, catching the harsh cafe lighting. The ironclad proof lay scattered across the table, suffocating every single lie he had ever told. He looked at me. He looked down at the property deed. He looked back at me. I waited. The silence in our corner of the cafe stretched out until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the table. This was it, the moment of truth. All it would take was 2 words. Thank you. Or maybe I apologize. But human nature is the hardest thing on earth to change. Instead of bowing his head, his jaw clamped shut. I could hear his teeth grinding together. He looked at me with cold, unapologetic eyes and uttered the most disgusting sentence I had ever heard. Even so, you still shouldn't have done this to your own family. A wave of pure pity washed over my chest. It pushed out the last remaining traces of anger. He would rather lose the roof over his head. He would rather lose his vehicles. He would rather lose his daughter and be exposed as a freeloading fraud than lower his fake, fragile ego for 5 seconds. He planted his hands on the table and shoved his wooden chair back. It screeched harshly against the linoleum floor. I'm leaving, he snapped. He spun around and power-walked toward the exit. The bells above the glass door jingled wildly as he pushed through. The same man who stood tall and banished me into the freezing snow on Christmas was now tucking his tail and running away from a battlefield made of his own lies. That left 3 women at the table. Sophie finally picked her head up. Her face was a wreck, mascara running down her cheeks in dark, messy lines. She stared blankly at the college tuition receipts with my name stamped on the payment lines. I thought Mum and Dad paid for all of this. She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes wide and terrified. I'm sorry, Beatrix. I looked at her. It was a genuine apology. The entitlement was gone, but it was years too late. I reached across the table and gathered the paperwork. I squared the edges perfectly and slipped them back into my leather briefcase. My mother reached across the table. Her wrinkled fingers lightly touched the back of my hand, tracing over the faded burn scar near my knuckles. I am so sorry, Beatrix, she whispered, her voice breaking. I nodded slowly, but I pulled my hand away. Her touch was warm, but it meant nothing now. You cannot erase 19 years of profound financial and emotional damage with one gentle touch at a cafe. You do not get to ignore the bleeding until the body hits the floor and then apologize for the mess. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the property, I said, snapping the brass latches on my briefcase shut. Sebastian is handling the sale. Every pound from the equity will be deposited into a restricted retirement trust for Mum. As for Sophie, you are on your own now. I stood up. I reached up and adjusted the stiff collar of my combat uniform, making sure the brass was perfectly aligned. I'm not blocking your phone numbers, I told them, looking down at the table. But do not call me unless it is a matter of life or death. I turned my back and walked out of the Richmond tea house. The London sky was a flat, dull grey, threatening another snowstorm. But as I took a deep breath of the freezing air, my chest had never felt lighter. The toxic anchor was finally cut. Starting that day, I was only fighting for myself. The rest of that winter dragged by at a brutal pace. The sharp scrape of snow shovels against the pavement became the soundtrack to the new reality. The Harrington family moved out of the large house on the exact 29th day of their eviction notice. Sebastian listed the property and liquidated it in record time. The equity was funneled into a highly restricted trust account. It paid out a fixed monthly allowance, exactly enough to cover the rent for a modest 2-bedroom flat for my mother. Nothing more. There were no more catered Christmas dinners to show off to the neighbours. No more brand new Range Rovers parked in the driveway. They were ripped out of their golf club delusion and dropped face first onto the hard concrete of the working class. Sophie was forced to take a cashier job at Sainsbury's. A month into her employment, my phone rang. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't ask for a single pound. My feet hurt so badly, she complained, her voice sounding completely physically drained. I didn't offer any sympathy. I just let the silence hold the line. But then she said something that actually made me stop what I was doing. "I probably should have been doing this years ago," she muttered. "I've been so useless." My absolute ruthlessness had forced her into withdrawal. By cutting off her financial blood supply, she had no choice but to detox from her own entitlement and learn how to function as an adult. A few days later, a text popped up from my mother. "I am learning how to cook again. It is much cheaper than eating out at restaurants. And what about me?" I stayed in my small rented flat near the base. For the first time in my entire adult life, I used my military paycheck on myself. I bought a high-end mattress that actually supported my back. I bought a solid oak reading desk. I enrolled in an advanced tactical strategy course. There were no more random emergencies dropped in my face. No more manipulative weeping phone calls at 2 in the morning. My military discipline was no longer required to act as a sandbag against the relentless artillery fire of my family's bad choices. Instead, I used it to rebuild the walls of my own personal boundaries. I actually felt peace. April knocked on the door in London. The heavy sheets of ice out on the Thames finally began to break apart, turning into slush. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. I was outside my flat using a push broom to clear the winter debris off the small patch of concrete near my front door. The air smelled damp, carrying the faint scent of thawing dirt. Suddenly, the harsh grating sound of old tires rubbing against the asphalt broke the silence. A beaten-up, rust-spotted pickup truck pulled over to the curb. It was a complete junker, the kind of vehicle you buy for £200 in cash from a sketchy used lot. The engine sputtered, rattling loudly before finally dying out. The heavy rusted driver's side door creaked open. A man stepped out onto the pavement. His posture was hunched. He looked incredibly frail, as if the last 4 months had aged him a decade. The arrogance was completely gone. The designer clothes were replaced by a faded flannel jacket. It was my father. He stood there on the edge of the curb exactly 10 paces away from me. He shoved his bare hands deep into his jacket pockets. His shoulders hunched against the lingering spring chill. I stopped sweeping. I gripped the wooden handle of the broom with both hands, my feet planted firmly on the concrete. The final unexploded piece of ordnance from the Christmas war had just driven itself right up to my front door. I stood perfectly straight on the concrete walkway. Both of my hands gripped the wooden handle of the push broom. I maintained a safe, tactical distance. My father took a few slow steps forward. The arrogant, overbearing glare that used to command the dining room was completely gone. In its place was just a hollow, exhausted look, the look of a man who had been thoroughly ground down by the harsh reality of living on a strict budget. He stopped. He swallowed hard. I watched his Adam's apple bob against the collar of his faded flannel shirt. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was thick and raspy, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. I was wrong. 4 short words, but they completely smashed through the massive brick wall of pride he had spent his entire adult life building. Taking his house was a calculated tactical strike. Repossessing the cars was just a logistical consequence of his own arrogance. But the ultimate, most brutal punishment was forcing this stubborn man to stand on a public sidewalk and verbally admit his own failure to the daughter he threw away. "I should have protected you that night," he continued, his voice trembling now. "I failed you." A single hot tear spilled over his lower eyelid. It tracked slowly through the deep wrinkles on his rough, weathered cheek. I looked at the old man standing in front of me. My chest felt incredibly light. There was no hatred left in my blood. There was no burning desire for revenge. There was only a quiet, steady pity. I let go of the broom. The wooden handle clattered loudly against the pavement. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and wrapped my arms around his hunched shoulders. It was a rigid, stiff hug, a soldier's embrace. It was awkward, brief, and incredibly heavy. That 10-second physical contact did not magically erase 19 years of extreme financial abuse. It did not heal the emotional scars left behind from countless nights I spent worrying about their debts while dodging mortar fire. And it certainly was not an open invitation for him to walk back into my daily life. It was simply the act of lowering my weapon. I refused to carry the heavy, toxic weight of resentment in my rucksack for a single day longer. I was officially discharging myself from their war. He patted my back twice with a heavy hand. He pulled away, wiping his face with the back of his dirty sleeve. "Thank you, Beatrix." He turned around and began the slow, heavy walk back to the rusted pickup truck. He pulled the creaky metal door open and climbed inside. The ruined engine choked, sputtered, and finally roared to life, kicking a thick cloud of black exhaust smoke out of the tailpipe. I stood on the damp spring earth and watched the battered truck roll down the street, turning the corner and disappearing from sight. The Battle of Christmas night was officially over. I never took a single thing that belonged to them. I simply took back control of what was mine. I used cold, calculated discipline to teach my family a brutal lesson their own blind entitlement could never grasp. Self-respect is never selfish. Protecting your own perimeter is a basic survival instinct. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a parasite is to permanently cut off the host. I turned around and walked back inside my flat. I locked the heavy steel door behind me. Warm spring sunlight cut through the glass windows, casting bright squares across the quiet, empty room. There was no screaming. There were no financial demands waiting to drain my life away. There was only profound, priceless peace, and I bought it with my own courage. If you are trapped in a family dynamic that treats your sacrifices like an obligation, remember this. Sometimes cutting off the supply line is the greatest act of love you can offer.